Chasing Leviathan is a podcast about pursuing truth, one big question at a time through the discipline of listening. Truth is too big to tame, but if we pay close attention, we might get the chance to glimpse something truly magnificent. So please join me in this pursuit, 1 week at a time. Hello, and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Wehry, and I'm here today with Dr. William Adams, Associate Professor of Psychology at Duquesne University, and we're talking about his book, A Wild and Sacred Call, Nature-Psyche-Spirit, part of the State University of New York Transpersonal and Humanistic Psychology series. Dr. Adams, Will, glad to have you on today.
Hey there, PJ. I really appreciate the invitation to talk about these matters that I think are really crucial for our world today. So, yeah, and I'm glad you call me Will. That's what I go by.
I used to teach high school, and they enforced me being called Mr. Wehry, and I just never felt comfortable with it. And so I appreciate that impulse. Definitely have always just gone by PJ. It just seems to fit me better. But as we look at your book, Wild and Sacred Call, why this book? I mean, like anything about climate change does have that house on fire. You know, you quote the Greta Thunberg line. It has that house on fire quality. But why this book, and why is it your answer and your project in regards to the current climate crisis?
Yes. Yeah, so I see the climate crisis as a symptom of a bigger problem. And it seems like to me that our confused and violent and anguished relationship with the rest of nature is really the core issue of our era, the core ethical calling of our era, and to create a mutually enhancing relationship between us and the rest of nature. I think that's really the calling, the ethical calling, a wild and sacred call, which is the title of my book. And so my book was my best scholarly response to that call, that crucial call of our era.
I did want to ask you, and you mentioned seems to be, if I understood correctly, part of the whole Department of Psychology at Duquesne, that you're comfortable integrating philosophy, especially continental philosophy, into a lot of your work. Can you talk a little bit about the research and methodology used for this book? Because it is unusual, at least by most academic standards.
Yes. Well, I'm very privileged to teach at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We have a really radical alternative progressive psychology program. And we just had our 60th anniversary celebration back in the spring. And in a field, psychology, which I have great respect for, but I also can critique, a field that, like many today, tends to be rather conservative in wanting to have certain traditions upheld, which I appreciate. To have an alternative program that has flourished for 60 years is quite an accomplishment. And by alternative, I mean we're grounded in really thinking through the foundations of what it means to be human and to be human with others, including to be human with others that are of the natural world, the more than human natural world. Like, what are the ontological and epistemological and ethical foundations that we need to be tuned into to craft a psychology that can serve folks well, both in research and in theory and in psychotherapy. We have a a PhD program in clinical psychology, and I've practiced therapy for a long time. So, grounded in existentialism and phenomenology and hermeneutics and post-structuralism and continental philosophy. And it's a program that allows me to bring in um, the psychological or psychospiritual sensibilities of the great spiritual traditions. Buddhism and Christianity are the two that I know the best. I bring in some other things in the book, but those are the two that I know the best and I work with more closely. So that's a long prelude to say what was my method and methodology for crafting the book. My primary methodology, methodology to me means the logos of the method, kind of the theory of the method, and the method itself is more procedural. Okay. So the logos of the method for me was, how do I write a book that doesn't simply talk about our relations with the rest of nature, but somehow creates the conditions by way of a text, creates the experiential conditions for seeing that relationship more deeply and transforming that relationship for human well-being and for the well-being of the rest of nature. So that was the core methodological orientation. It wasn't, I wasn't trying to like just represent ideas. I was trying to present things in a fresh way that might sponsor, real transformation. And I work phenomenologically, so I try to keep returning to actual, tangible, lived experience. Now, in our relations, our troubled relations with the rest of nature, I don't think phenomenology is enough. We need systemic sociocultural transformation, economic, political, uh, religious, um, social transformation, systemic transformation. But that transformation, I think, still is grounded in people's lived experience. If you don't have direct lived experiential contact with conscious contact with the rest of nature, uh, then you're not going to have any motivation to sponsor new laws or economic policies or whatever. Okay, so I ground my work in phenomenology, which has to do with a careful attunement to understanding and unfolding lived experience. So the book is filled with stories from everyday life, some from my own life, some from other people's lives, people that I know, people that I've met. It's also filled with poetry because I think poets are the uh, exemplary masters of articulating lived experience. Um, and it's set into dialogue with key spiritual and philosophical ideas and psychological ideas that I find very crucial in our relations with the rest of nature. So that kind of orients you and maybe orients the listeners to where the book is coming from.
Even as you talked about what's important to the decaying department of psychology, and you mentioned like this approaching psychology as what does it mean to be human? I mean, I think that's in large part what drew me to your book, right? Like when you talk about, I have a big questions podcast, and you could argue there are other big questions or bigger questions, but definitely, what does it mean to be human is one of those big questions. So again, thank you for coming on today. I'm really excited to talk through all this.
And even to say, what does it mean to be human is a little bit abstract. I'm really interested in what does it mean to live well, to love well. That's really what I'm interested in.
Right, right. Well, that's you kind of end with the nature. Love is our nature. Love is our calling. Love is our path. Love is our fruition. And you mentioned you referenced Christianity, and that there's this idea of perfection, which in a Cartesian world, in a technologically boxed in world has kind of this mathematical concept to it. But I was drawn to that idea of when in scripture, when they're talking about perfection, they're talking about completion. And it's often in a very natural way, talking about in terms of trees and harvest. And if your tree bears a lot of good fruit, it is perfect. It is matured. And so this idea of fruition of maturity, I've always found, connected with this idea of human flourishing. I think these are healthier ways for our society to go. And so that some of this is me making sure I'm tracking with you, but also I'm geeking out a little bit. I'm not gonna lie.
No, it's great. Share whatever ideas come to mind. I mean, really, that's what a real conversation is. We spark each other. Yeah. So please share whatever comes to mind, and we'll go back and forth. Yeah.
I the temptation when you say a wild and sacred call, nature, psyche, spirit, is to say, well, what do you mean by nature? And I'll kind of ask that, but I'm going to ask that knowing that your response is to avoid this hard and fast definition. Even as you have that whole section on powerfully charged words. To maybe if you could orient, or one of the words that came to me as I was reading what you were writing, you could inspire our audience with how you use words like nature and psyche and spirit.
You do go for the big questions, don't you?
No pressure. Yeah.
Well, yeah, the subtitle of the book is Nature hyphen Psyche hyphen Spirit. And the hyphens are really important because I think each of these dimensions are different sides of one another. They're interwoven. They're an integral unity, really, a dynamic one. And that's in contrast to the core malady of our era, seeing humans and the rest of nature being separate. And we can circle back to this. Because in a way, that's what the book is about, and is aspiring to create conditions for us to overcome that delusion that we're really separate from, elevated above, and entitled to exploit the rest of nature. Okay. But what do I mean by nature? In the midst of writing the book, I came across a book, and I can't remember the guy that wrote it, but it was like keywords in the English language. And he said, nature is perhaps the most mysterious and complex word in the whole English language. And so in the introduction, I do take some time to go into detailed variations of this core word that's pointing to a core experience. Off the top of my head, I probably can't even remember all of them because there's probably 8 or 10 of them that I list. But let me just name 2 that I think are important. 2 or 3. Partly, I'm referring to the more than human or the other than human natural world. More than human natural world is a beautiful phrase from David Abram, the eco-philosopher, who's been a great inspiration and ally for me. So I'm partly referring to non-human nature. And I often say the rest of nature because we humans are nature. We're an expression of, a manifestation of the nature of nature. But I think one of the core things that we need to do these days is to become conscious of our relationship with the rest of nature, and thereby foster more, compassionate, healthy, life-enhancing relations rather than alienated, anguished, exploitive relations, destructive relations. So partly I'm meaning the more than human natural world. Um, I am meaning us humans inseparably. Okay. Another way that I use nature is uh, more akin to the um, uh, philosophical and spiritual sense of the, the whole of all that is, the all-inclusive, all-permeating life itself. Not just biological life, but this whole great life um, that goes by this whole great unnameable mystery that goes by many names, right? That it could be called. I mean, even to say it is bizarre because it's not an it, but this whole great mystery could be called um, life or reality or the universe or cosmos or being, and if you want to turn to spiritual traditions, perhaps God or the Tao. Um, um, I, there are ways that what I'm calling nature shows itself, and um, that to me is thoroughly congruent with these classic sort of time-honored spiritual names for the unnameable mystery.
As you were talking about the humans being separate, but we're really not, right? Like we shouldn't be. Remember the first time, and it was such an eye-opening experience, and it was from the movie Ghost in the Shell. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but
I don't
they
know that one. Huh.
the it might have been the second one or the first. I can't remember. Like there's like a whole series, and but the two characters are talking, looking out over the city, and one of the characters says to the other, and I believe she compared it to a termite mound. She said, we understand that a termite mound is an expression of the termite's DNA, but we don't look around at the city and recognize that, like really these are artifacts of our DNA, like that, because we see ourselves as separate or as a part, we don't recognize that even the cities and the technologies that grows out are expressions of what it means to be human. And that was really eye opening because there's always been nature and technology, especially growing up in like kind of a modernist worldview. I think I was right on the cusp of where that started transition. But this idea of like the separateness from nature, and instead seeing like, I mean, the metals we take, they're still the Earth's metals, even if we arrange them differently. And so it's still all part of the this entirety, this reality.
That's exactly right, including we ourselves,
Right.
and including our DNA. I think our DNA is actually an artifact of that great mystery. Not that the stuff that builds up is an artifact of our DNA. I think it goes the other way around. Um, that our DNA and our embodied life and our culture are not artifacts, but like manifestations, emanations of this great life, this great seamless life that we share. Uh, but we act as if we're separate. We think as if we're separate. We imagine that our well-being can be independent of the well-being of the rest of nature. And this creates a really paranoid and greedy approach to the world. And I'm not saying we're not different from the rest of nature. I mean, you and I are different. I'm different from my dog laying here next to me. I'm different from the rhododendron bush. But it's you know seen through a sensitive eye. You might even say a contemplative eye. It's very clear we're not separate. We're not separate, and that separation creates fear, and defensiveness, and then greed and exploitation. So that's the core delusion of humankind, I think.
That lack of recognition, even and this is, I think, speaks to something I appreciate about your book, as you talk about the climate crisis only being a symptom of a deeper root issue, and that's why, if I understand you correctly, your goal is transformation, not information. This book isn't supposed to be about the climate crisis, because it's not about us being able to control or change the world around us. It is about, first and foremost, the call, the need for our own transformation. Is that a fair way to articulate, at least in one aspect?
Yeah, I think that's a sensitive reading. That's really it. I mean, there's plenty of facts, there's plenty of information out there, and information's important uh, as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough. And at best, the information can deepen, deepen into real understanding, to wisdom, to transformation that comes to its fruition in engaged, caring, compassionate action. Yeah.
And I think it would be unfair, as you've talked so much about lived experience, not to at least uh, dig into a few of the stories you relate. And there's that first really beautiful one about your son Eli seeing the deer and claiming, it's falling from heaven, it's jumping from heaven. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about how that fits into the scheme of things and how that inspired and helped you? You talk about poetry as phenomenological data. Um, and obviously, you want to stay away from just like the idea that it's just an info dump. But what can you speak to how you interpret that story in a way that enriches your soul?
Yeah. First of all, it was just such a beautiful experience. I mean, I start the book um, uh, with a photograph of Eli when he was about 2.5, looking out a big picture window in our previous home, and right on the other side of the picture window is a white-tailed deer fawn, uh, and I walked into it was in my study, um, and I walked in and snapped a photograph really quick because it was just so beautiful. It was like two toddlers enraptured by each other, fascinated by each other, right? Um, and then as I was writing the book, um, I was aware that uh, a real anguishing circumstance in our world today, that if kids are having less and less aware contact with the rest of nature. Richard Louv, the journalist, coined this term nature deficit disorder, which I think is a powerful um, term and even more powerful malady. Um, and so I knew that Eli had that intimate encounter with that deer, and that my wife Holly and I tried to help our kids be aware and tuned in to the natural world, in the midst of a technologically dominated world. Um, Sometimes we did better and sometimes not so well. Uh, uh, but then when he was about, uh, I don't know, I'd have to just guess. I could count it back, but maybe he was 10 or so. Um, we were driving away from our home uh, at a different place. We live in the woods now. And he saw this white-tailed deer, an adult, bounding over a log. And he says, Dad, that deer was like falling from heaven. And I was just struck by the awe that he felt. And and also the phrase, because our family is quite spiritual, but we don't really talk about heaven that much. Uh, I mean, maybe hardly at all. I mean, uh, uh, I mean, maybe as they got older, I celebrated my sense that heaven, like the Gospels say, the kingdom of heaven is among us. The kingdom of heaven is within us, or you know, um, the quote I give in the book: all the way to heaven is heaven, right? Um, so for him to actually see the heavenly, the sort of sacred dimension of that deer gracefully bounding over that log, I thought that's it. That's really it. And um, if if indeed we could see that spontaneously, not because someone is telling us to see the world that way, not because the Ten Commandments or the Buddhist precepts, some sort of external code, tells us that we should see the world that way. But if we really saw the world spontaneously like that, then we don't have mass extinction of species. Then we don't have mountain range annihilation mining, which I talk about later in the book. Then we don't have, all the exploitation and excessive, burning of fossil fuels. We don't have global warming. No, spontaneously, we relate with care and compassion. Yeah, that holy, that sacred dimension is just completely evident, not because someone has to tell you that. And late in the book, I cite that beautiful poem from Wendell Berry, where he says something like, there are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. And I think we desecrate nature because of our confused views, grounded in that fantasy of separation. So Eli wasn't separate. He was deeply, just spontaneously attuned to that glorious event.
Yeah, and I think my first response is, "Oh, what an incredible example of childlike wonder." But what I appreciate is you didn't use the word wonder; you used the word awe, which captures that spiritual, that sacred dimension to it. That I do think, obviously, human beings, I think, have their own capacity to develop, I'll say, evil or to develop sin. If you, to use theological language. But it is astonishing how much is trained in us, right? When you talk about how much is trained out of us in this case, that this loss of insight, this loss of wonder. Um, I think of my own kids and the joy they take, even in grass. And yeah, I have 5 kids, and the youngest is a year old, and I mean, the way that like the dogs or like a dragonfly just makes her whole face light up. And to call this like, we have this little chunk of backyard in a suburban area. Nature is like, it feels desecrated, but she finds the joy in it, right? And that's something uh, that and this I think is where what I wanted to ask you about next is that training aspect, that development, is that I want to nurture that wonder, I want to nurture that awe. um, but that's where you talk about the development of the ego, because that's where we see the loss of the child is in the formation of that identity.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, kids are just spontaneously in awe, in wonderment, in delight, um, mixed in with temper tantrums and all sorts of stuff, right?
Right. Yeah,
But
you're right.
um,
I did not have to teach my kids to hit
um,
other kids, right? That was I did not have to teach them that. Yeah.
but I think you're right. I think that does get cultured out of us. That and with uh, you know, misguided educational systems and it gets cultured out of us. Uh, and one of the things that gets cultured into us is some fantasy that we really are separate from the rest of nature. And I think that partly has to do with the development of a certain kind of ego-centered self on the one hand, and inseparably or intertwined with this, um, a cultural ethos and worldview that emerged in the modern era that um, celebrated our supposed independence and autonomy from the rest of nature, our capacity, as Descartes said, to be masters and controllers, masters and possessors, I think he said, of nature. Completely, misguided and I mean, there's ways we can back up and understand where this desire comes from, but because nature's not all sweetness and light, of course. It's fierce and dangerous, and so I understand sort of wish to master and control nature, but what hubris, right? As if we could control this great, wild, you know, reality. So, um, yeah. So when I was trying to understand if, I as I see it, separation is the sort of core malady from which springs all evil, all sin, all destructiveness. Uh, how does this separation arise? And I think it arises partly by way of our um, psychosocial development, looking at psychological theory, and it arises also, these two are intertwined, from cultural influences that valorize a kind of independence that's ultimately illusory, but practically destructive.
I remember someone talking about the climate crisis and making the point that the planet is not scared of humans and what humans are doing. We are going to be the ones who will reap the and the animals as well. But like the Earth is not going to be destroyed by what we're doing, right? Like the planet itself, it's bigger than us, and so to be clear about the ramifications of what we're doing and why it's um, yeah, this isn't to downplay it, but also it's I think more to illustrate how big the systems in play are, right? Like if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and it's heartening in one way. I mean, just to appreciate the infinite depth and intelligence and beauty of this whole Earth, or even whole cosmos, but we'll bring it down to Earth. I think, yeah, that's going to continue unfolding whether or not we find a way to stay around as a species or not. At the same time, and this is what's so anguishing, um, our confusion is leading to the extinction of countless species and the extirpation of countless species and the destruction of habitat and the diminishment of biodiversity, um, and the diminishment of human existence because our kids are suffering from this and we're suffering from it because the all all the four-legged ones and the winged ones and the leafed ones and the scaly ones and the blowing and flowing and airy ones, these have been our relational partners throughout the whole history of humankind. Our day-to-day relational partners with whom we've had this intimate rapport. Uh, and when we extinguish these and when we withdraw into our human-built world, screen-focused world, uh, and lose aware contact with the rest of nature, we're losing something at the heart of being human. So I am heartened that the Earth itself is, I think, infinitely resilient. Um, and I'm really heartbroken, heart opened in response to the suffering that we're wreaking on this wild and sacred Earth.
When you first spoke, I misunderstood when you said we live in the screen world. Part of that's living in this world of screens. Part of that's living in Florida, and so everybody's porch is screened in. And so I immediately thought of the screens there. But what I love is the ambivalence of that. Because obviously in our culture, when we think of screens now, we think of phones, think of iPads and computers, even what we're doing right now. And what's interesting is about the
Even what
way,
we're doing
like,
right now, which, yeah.
yeah, we have these portals that we think of this different way of accessing. But an interesting thing about the word screen is it's another way of keeping things out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I grew up in the South. You're in Florida. I grew up in North Carolina. And sitting outside in the summer, screen porches were nice because you didn't get so many mosquito bites.
Right.
I get that. Like I say, nature can be fierce, and mosquitoes are just being mosquitoes. Um, uh, but I think there is a deeper um, tendency that's been enculturated to screen ourselves from close, intimate contact with the rest of nature. And that's to our detriment, and it's also to the detriment of all these other beings and presences whose life, whose very existence is being threatened because of our confusion.
I'd like to return to something you mentioned earlier, that you're trying to rekindle or keep alive the wonder and the inspiration, and not rely on these external factors, or these external standards like the Ten Commandments, like the Buddhist precepts. What role do you see for these laws or these training techniques in should we what's the point of setting these up as a culture? Or is there nothing positive about them? I don't think you're going to say that, but obviously that's,
Mhm.
the other side of the
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, my main point is that I think when we can tune into our direct, intimate experience, ethical actions flow quite naturally. I think it's a I think it's a misguided notion to think that we're just like intrinsically, destructive and aggressive and greedy creatures. Um, so I think my sense is that when we attune to our own direct experience, uh, that's the best ethical guideline. But of course, uh, external ethical guidelines are helpful within, you know, um, in a relative way. It's really helpful to agree that we're going to drive on the right hand side of the road. Even though in England
Yeah.
they drive on the left, it's completely arbitrary, but we agree because if people didn't have that agreement, we'd have a lot of car crashes. So having certain guidelines is helpful. Um, I think there's also an element where the sort of religious um, ethical pointers uh, are really pointing out the deeper nature of how things always already are. Um, and it can remind us to tune into those um, uh, and embody them and actualize them. Um, uh, thou shalt not kill, could be taken as a, external commandment from somewhere else, a religious authority or God or whatever. Um, but it could be pointing to the reality that if you meet face to face with another person and you open to your direct experience, you're not going to want to kill them. You're going to want to care for them. That's the way we are. I think that's actually the way we are. Um, and so I think um, these external sort of prescriptions are actually reminding us of the deeper nature of things that then we can embody and live up to relationally.
Yeah. Even as you talk about these powerfully charged words, there's echoes in what you're saying, into Galatians, where it says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, gentleness, kindness. Against such there is no law, right? Like when you are walking in the Spirit, as it says, when you're walking this way, it's like you don't need the precepts, right? Because you don't have to make laws against someone being kind, or well, if you are, the law is wrong, and so that makes a lot of sense to me. Um, how do you
Hmm. Hmm.
appropriate Christian mysticism in your book? Can you talk about that chapter?
Sure. Um, I grew up Presbyterian in North Carolina. My family went to church up until I was like I don't know, early teenager, and then we sort of drifted away for various reasons. Um, I came back to spirituality by way of psychology, getting interested in the psychology of consciousness. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I was I was studying also undergrad psychology. Although I thought I was going to teach tennis, so I didn't major in psychology as an undergrad. Um, but I got interested in consciousness, and that led me to meditation. And the most accessible forms of meditation back then, um, early 80s, were Asian, particularly Buddhist. Um, and I got very involved in practicing Buddhist meditation, first with Vipassana meditation and then Zen. And I've been working with a Zen teacher for 24 years. Uh, um, but in the course of doing that meditation, doing that Buddhist practice, and it's not only meditative practice, but it's bringing meditative sensibilities into your everyday life. It's not a matter of having special experiences on a cushion. It's a matter of living with awareness and compassion, love, justice. So in the course of doing that, I rediscovered my root spiritual tradition freshly, and I started reading the Christian mystics. And I thought, oh my, they never showed me this stuff in Sunday school.
No.
It's incredible. Is this my root tradition? Wow. And I was just astonished and inspired and delighted. And um, and so, each tradition has its own way of articulating and fostering uh, a life that's fully alive, that's engaged, that's living well, that's loving well. And sometimes the Christian tradition touches me in ways that the Buddhist tradition doesn't. So for and I also know that um, in the United States, at least, there's way more people that have some familiarity with Christianity than Buddhism, even though Buddhism is growing and um, touching many people. But sometimes it depends on who I'm talking with. Also, it's easier, clearer for me to use Christian language. But it's not just that practical aspect. It really is. I can see things differently by way of Christian language and Christian practice. Um, so let me try to give an example. Okay. Um, well, actually, let me give an example that uses both Christian language and Buddhist language, and this is how it works for me.
Sure.
So there's a famous Zen story where a Zen practitioner said, before I practiced Zen, um, I just saw mountains as mountains and rivers as rivers. Right? But after my practice deepened, then I didn't see mountains and I didn't see rivers anymore. But when I got to the heart of the matter and really clarified what I was seeing, it was mountains and rivers. So, so one way that I read this is, we sort of see things in a habitual, conventional way. There's the mountains over there, like separate objects, separate things over there, and me over here, in this sort of conventional self-world separation, subject-object separation. That's a conventional way to see things. Okay. Then, by way of contemplative practice, those supposed separations start to dissolve or be seen through, seen as illusory in the first place. There's never really any severance in the first place. So, there's sort of like this, not separate anymore. But that doesn't remove me to some sort of like spiritual realm somewhere in some other place. In the end, it grounds me to relate to mountains, rivers, trees, other people in a different way, right? So the third is, re-engaging with this world, but seeing it not as a separate from me, but as this precious, sacred, manifestation of this great mystery, right? So that's the first side. Now you ask about Christian mysticism. So Saint John of the Cross, the great Spanish mystic, has a poem called "The Spiritual Canticle." I think I'm remembering the right poem. He's got a lot of poems, but this is a love poem to God, and identically, it's a love poem to the natural world. And he has this this part. He does things in an interesting way. He writes a poem, and then he shares it with monks and nuns, and they say, "Whoa, John, this is wonderful. Can you explain it to us?" And then he writes a commentary on his poem. Okay, so I could find the poem, but I'll just do it from memory. He says something like, the mountains, the rivers, the love-stirred breezes, these are what my beloved is to me. And beloved is his name for God, right? So you mountains, rivers, love-stirring breezes, these are what my beloved is to me. In other words, mountains, rivers, the breezes, these are God. Okay? So if I put myself in St. John's shoes and kind of echoing that first Zen story, which I think is the same experience, it's just languaged in a different tradition. I see, okay, I look out at the mountains, I just see mountains, separate objects over there, right? I do contemplative prayer, Christian contemplative prayer, for example. And through a contemplative eye, I don't see mountains separate from me. I see God. Oh, wow. Not as some abstract idea, but I'm grounded. And then the third step is, I relate to this mountain as a sacred presence, a sacred presencing. Okay. This is completely consistent with the teachings of Christ. Christ has this beautiful teaching in the Gospel of Thomas from the so-called Gnostic Gospels, but supposedly authentic sayings of Christ. He says, split a piece of wood, you will find me there. Lift up a stone, you will find me there. Right? And when he says me, he's not referring to me. This actually helped me when I was reading the Gospels. When it says Christ said or Jesus said, I think it's important to remember that it's not referring just to him as a skin-bodied historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, but also it's referring to God, right? So when Christ says, cleave a piece of wood, you'll find me there. Lift up a stone, you will find me there. He's saying, cleave a piece of wood, you'll find God there. Lift up a stone, you'll find God there. Because the kingdom of heaven is among us, within us, everywhere, right? And so if I look at a mountain and I see the presencing of God, I'm surely not going to enact mountain range annihilation coal mining on that mountain, wiping out the whole mountain because I want to make money getting that coal underneath. I'm going to relate to that mountain in a very different way.
I think if you allow me, because my next question is, I want to be respectful of your time. Uh, can you articulate that final chapter about uh, love is our nature, love is our calling, love is our path, and love is our fruition? And that seems like the natural outflowing of even what you're speaking about.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's really the crucial aspect. Um, um, see, these are just my best linguistic gestures to put something, out there that touches people that's really ineffable, I think. Um, but those things that are unsayable really call to be said in the right context with the right person. That's what I tried to do with this book. Um, Let me try to do it as concisely as I can. So, love is our nature, uh, our calling, our path, and our fruition. Um, Love is one of the classic names for that great unnameable. Love is one of the classic names for God. Uh, uh, and according to the Christian tradition, God is our deepest nature. Christ says, "I and God are one." Uh, and then he says, "Praise, may they all be one, as I am with you." So Christ is saying, look, that union, that deep identity with God, it's not limited to me. I realized it. I woke up to it. I see it, but it's not limited to me. This is our human birthright. May they all be one, right? Christ says, I am the vine and you are the branches. When he says I, he means God. God is the vine and we are the branches. So what's the relationship between a branch and the vine? A branch is how the vine is showing up over here. And this other branch is the vine showing up differently over here. There's no separation. We are, a form of that great, let's say, vine. Okay. We are a form of God. And if God is love, our deepest nature is love. Always, even if we don't recognize it. Another way to say it in Christian terms, God is loving us into being right here and now. Uh, uh, and we haven't backed up and said this, PJ, but you've read the book. But when I say God, I'm certainly not talking about some man, up in the clouds with a beard that's, giving us rewards and punishment, catching us when we're naughty and nice. That's like Santa Claus, right? That's not what I mean by God. I don't really know what I mean, but I'm trying to gesture towards some great, all-encompassing, all-permeating mystery. Right? So our deepest nature is love. Um, but not love in an abstract way. We're called to embody love, actualize love in the nitty-gritty circumstances of our daily lives. What's the greatest commandment of all, Christ says? To love, that God is one, And, if God is one, we're not separate from God. There's only one, without a second, as the Hindu tradition says, one without a second. God is one, and then we love and love our neighbor. Love God with all your heart and mind and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. Okay. So we are love, but we're called to actualize that love in relation with our neighbors. And those neighbors aren't just two-legged ones. They're the whole rest of this sacred earth community. Right? So we're called to do that. Well, how do we do that? Well, we follow a path of doing our best to be loving, or to be love itself, day by day by day. And when we do that, for the moment, that's the fruit. That's the fruition. That's what I think that's really what we're here for. That's what we're called to do. We have to do it, even that we're confused and frightened and fallible. We offer it the best we can, and sometimes there's that fruit. And all of these are inseparable, I think.
Well, if you can't ending on like work better at loving each other, I don't think you can. I don't think anyone can disagree with that, and I don't think we can. I can think of a better way to end it. If you could give us uh, one way that you would encourage people to love each other, whether they're two-legged neighbors or four-legged neighbors or crawling neighbors, what's one way that you would encourage people to love each other this week after listening to this episode?
Yeah, my invitation would be the invitation I give myself every day. It's just to show up as present, open, and awake as I can in my encounters, feeling grateful for this life that we're given freely, by no accomplishment of our own. We just celebrated Thanksgiving, but every day can be a day of Thanksgiving. And uh, when we're awake, it's very clear that we're not separate from each other. So I would say, just like step, since we're talking about love, not just for other humans, which is crucially important, of course, but love and engaged love, not just abstract love, but engaged, practical love for the rest of nature. Step outside and let yourself be called by some aspect of the natural world. Let yourself appreciate that. Be in wonder, be in awe. And notice what's speaking to you. Um, and and usually when we do this, some sense of appreciation or gratitude wells up. And that gratitude can pour out and spill over, as care and love. Maybe in the moment, maybe later in the day. Um, there's no big secret here. It's just an ongoing. The whole world is our zendo. The whole world is our meditation hall. Uh, we bring our contemplative life into our everyday engagements, and when we're tuned in, we naturally respond with care. I don't think we have to force ourselves to do it. I think it's just opening again and again, letting go of our fears and habits and defenses and busyness. I think really pausing. If I could say anything, like just pause, pause, look deeply, see deeply. When we do that, love flows naturally.
Dr. Adams, Will, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today.
It's a privilege. It's a privilege. I was really, I'm grateful for the kinds of invitations, for the kinds of questions you posed, for the points you highlighted. Each of those, PJ, we could have paused and gone, for a long, long time. There's a lot of things that you shared that I'll keep pondering. And so anyway, I hope, I hope this touches people in some way, and I'm glad you gave us the opportunity. You've touched me, I have to say.